So here we go. I'll count on you a lot to kind of draw a lot of connections. My biggest emphasis here is to put a lot of resources in your hands. Okay? So if we want to bring the richness of the Catholic tradition to bear on the challenges of a digital society, one thing that we need a lot of is good bridge concepts. On the one hand, we need a way to formulate questions that figures from the tradition can answer back to us organically in their own cultural voice, you could say. And on the other hand, we want the ensuing conversation to actually help us to confront particular features of our own digital context. So today I want to argue that seeing media as memory tools and not only as communication tools can drastically enrich our ability to consult the tradition about digital media. There are three basic reasons for this. The first is simply that figures from the tradition consistently approach the media in front of them along these lines. The second reason, I think, converges with James's argument. We don't really understand digital media until we learn how to see them as memory technologies in their own right. But then I would also add a third reason, which I think is more general and in a certain sense undergirds the other two reasons. I think we don't fully understand the role of any media in human life until we grasp how people have always used them as extensions of their own biological memories, and of how biological memory has always functioned as a default interior medium in its own right. Okay. Although I am going to touch upon the second and a little more on the third reason today. My main focus will be on the first. I want to leave you with a good sense of how the tradition confronts media as memory technologies, and of what kinds of fruit we can enjoy from consulting them along those lines. So here's the plan. I'll start by explaining what exactly I mean by memory and by seeing media as memory technologies. And then I'm going to spend the bulk of our time discussing examples of what this sensitivity to media looks like. Towards the end, we'll look a little more closely at the example of Thomas Aquinas, since I think it really helps to clarify why memory matters in the first place. And then I'll close with some brief suggestions on how this approach can be applied today. Generally, what I am suggesting is a parallel way of thinking about media, that it's not meant to be exhaustive and all-consuming, and yet I do think it does speak or reach out to comprehensively to every instance of media use. You could say memory and communication are two dimensions of media use, and I'm making a plea that we consider the other dimension a whole lot, especially when trying to consult the tradition. So to start off then, what do I mean by memory? When I use this word, I'm referring principally to two natural, you could say biological faculties. The first is for retaining parts of our experience and then calling them back to mind at a later point. This is what psychologists today will call long-term memory. But I want to add, and I think each of these are equally important. I really want us to be thinking about the second one as well. Psychologists today call this working memory, a faculty for piecing together a coherent present moment in light of not only present experience but also past experience. This coherent sense or image or figure of our present moment is available both to the center and to the periphery of our conscious attention. It broadens our sense of where we are in space and time. That is why we don't just perceive a single moment simply as a kind of hint, but as a complex moment. And it forms a kind of home base for our proximate internal, for where we are in time and space, and a kind of home base for our you could say, a proximate internal background for our thoughts and for our interactions with the world. By memory, then, I also include what Christians often today will call the imagination. Not so much as a power for projecting new identities or futures, but more as a kind of inner landscape or treasury of images, stories, symbols, and so on, all of which frame, orient, integrate, or inform our identity, our thoughts, our feelings, our actions. We often call this imagination, but I think it also helps to call it memory, both because it brings the past to bear on the present, and also because it is part of how we negotiate our existence in time. So besides a kind of storage and retrieval faculty, memory is also a kind of inner space that we can cultivate in service to various life goals, much as we might organize or ornament our homes with specific ends in mind. And to think of memory in this dual sense fits with how, for biblical, patristic, and medieval authors, memory includes not only the recollection of experience or knowledge, but also the act of bearing those things in mind and allowing those things to be present here and now through ritual commemoration, as well as by seeing oneself and then acting as a member of that same story. So to think of media as memory technologies is to see them as devices or techniques that help us to extend, or that function to extend. I don't know if help is the right word always, but they function to extend, to share, to stabilize, maybe also to bestow a particular rhetorical form upon our long-term and our working memories. Okay, that's the main thesis and outline. That was pretty dense, right? So let's look at some concrete examples. Initially, some fairly easy ones from the tradition to see how this works out and to clarify what I mean here. So this is from Deuteronomy 6, where we find the first part of the Shema prayer. There's a lot to say here about orality and literacy, but I want to focus on what it implies about memory. First of all, let's recall that heart in the Old Testament, levav, can refer to one's memory as well as to the seat of one's intellect, will, emotions, character. So, several layers here. At one level, writing hovers in the background of Deuteronomy 6 as the written text of these words, right? These words that this is pointing to, that are held to be important, and probably this includes the entire teaching in chapters 5 to 26 of Deuteronomy. At another level, these injunctions in this middle paragraph count on that written text to help stabilize and preserve Israel's shared memory of God and of God's salvific acts. We also see writing and other media playing a key role in scaffolding the practices of verbal recitation. And also, if you follow a little longer to verses 20 to 25, something like catechesis, okay? By which the long-term memories, I'm sorry, I should have left this up here. Do you have the same children asking questions to their parents, just like in Exodus 12 and 13, I think, right? So another practice of memory building. That written text, right, and hovering in the background is going to stabilize those practices, which in turn will sort of form the long-term memories of individual Israelites. Will stock their memories, and also orient them in accordance with God's actions. So, by putting it this way, I've really emphasized the long-term memory formation part, but I also think there's a kind of working memory layer here. We should also say that writing here is helping to, you could say, scaffold a kind of extension of the Israelites' biological working memories out into a shared cultural ecology, which will do two things. On the one hand, that shared cultural ecology will simultaneously, it'll form their long-term memories, right? but it also feeds positively in the present moment in the ongoing cognitive processes that yield faith and obedience in daily life. Or to put it in moral theology terms, that shared cultural ecology helps to prop up the practical reasoning of Israelites. So, Israel remembers God, bears God and his actions in mind, obeys God's life-giving Torah, with the help of scripturally structured memorization and of scripturally scaffolded working memory. Okay, the next example I want us to consider is the prophet Ezekiel's description of his reception of God's word in terms of eating and digesting a scroll. I don't know if this means anything, but you also see this in the book of Revelation. I don't know what that means about apocalypses or not, but there it is. I like this example because it puts in full display a metaphor that not only tracks reliably with how the tradition has this sensitivity to media as memory, but also it shows us some pretty important trends in that sensitivity to media as memory that I think we would do well to consider in our own time. Okay, so there's the scroll, that's lamentation, wailing woe. Ezekiel eats it, and then there's a kind of response here, which is itself cashed out in digestive metaphors, and that's what I want to explore for a second. Through this long history, the metaphor of eating and digesting a written text generally points us, I think, to three important features of what you could call a shared approach to texts and to reading. And here I'm building a lot on the work of scholars like Ivan Illich and Mary Carruthers. First, the metaphor points us to reading practices that foster deep and integrative internalization. So Illich liked to point out how and others as well, but the readings of manuscripts in Semitic, Roman, and monastic contexts involved a subvocal muttering of a text. Not always, but very often. The reader decoded the text segments, right, back into an oral performance, held that performance coherently together in auditory working memory, and then interpreted their meaning. As many such readers were aware, reading in that way with the subvocal muttering, the oral performing, echoing back the words back to one's ear through one's mouth, helps you remember a text really well. But it also made it easy for them to imagine texts as something to be cherished and savored, because metaphors of tasting were easily accessible in such a practice. So St. Bernard speaks in this way when commenting on the Song of Songs. Enjoying their sweetness, I chew them over and over. Again, digestive metaphors. Psalm 119 does something similar with the Torah. And it's certainly okay, the main referent here is to God's word as a spiritual good that nourishes the human heart, right? That's the main point here. But we shouldn't miss the fact that such language and such reading practices also allude to the practice and the bodily experience of reading these texts in that kind of oral way, and of the importance of receiving them with one's entire being. Both can be true. This is a metaphor for receiving the word spiritually, but it also speaks to the experience itself. Secondly, we're talking about, so the second point I see in the Ezekiel passage is that we're talking about active reading, conceived as a kind of circle between meditation and memory. So it is obviously active reading, but in a particular way, a circle between meditation and memory. So in Bernard, you see that to read a text properly was also to ruminate on it. Also a very common metaphor here. So like a cow, you consume, you swallow, and then you regurgitate. You chew the cud, you break the spoken text down thoughtfully, carefully, over and over again, patiently, as you penetrate ever more deeply into its meaning, and it nourishes you all the more. Jerome, commenting on the Ezekiel text that I just showed you, assumes that for Ezekiel to hear God well would mean treasuring God's word in memory through what he calls assiduous meditation. Okay, so he also makes it clear that the reference to the heart in Ezekiel is being read as in terms of memory, right? And you get the internalization in memory through assiduous meditation practice. But ruminating like a cow also suggests a kind of reciprocal relationship between the assiduous meditation and the product of a good memory itself. Memory, especially when it is well ordered, is seen in this long tradition of reading as a kind of stomach that not only keeps but combines and prepares the fodder for further chewing. Like a cow, it comes back to your mouth. You chew it again. You echo it again into an oral performance. You keep thinking about it and you penetrate ever more deeply into it. Third point, good digestive reading involves an internalization process by which the text and the reader are transformed and conformed to one another. Certainly the reader is transformed, but the text in its own way is also transformed. Certainly actual digestion suggests such a process, as does the work of bees collecting nectar and turning it into honey. Notice that honey metaphors are coming in here. They've come in here more than once in Ezekiel, and the sweetness thing from Bernard. This too is very standard ground on the way that the metaphors are deployed to talk about this form of reading. So we might worry that talking about transforming the text and not just the reader involves a kind of creeping emphasis on one's own individual, original, idiosyncratic interpretation. Maybe in certain contexts it might, but within this tradition, as Gregory the Great, for example, clarifies, the goal here is rather to process and assimilate the text to the point where it becomes possible to live it out in one's present. To find ourselves in God's story, we have to cultivate an intimately accessible sense of how the parts of the story fit together, refer to each other, refer to God, to us, and to our future actions. There has to be reference in all these directions for it to really inform your practical reasoning. In the Ezekiel text, the fruit of appropriation is prophetic witness. But there's a jump that Jerome makes that I think is really important. He gleans something a lot more general, precisely by reading the text spiritually, or allegorically, you could say, linking it to Jeremiah and St. Paul, and then moving towards a moral or tropological interpretation of what's going on with Ezekiel, eating the text and then living it out, not only in terms of proclaiming the word, but confronting the world with compassion. Seeing the world as judged precisely by God's mercy. To put it another way, Jerome is building and helping us to build a personal memory structure for hearing God's word and acting on it. And to insist on the need for spiritual exegesis, you could say, is to affirm that my active response to God's word, my participation in the fulfillment of God's word here and now, my deepening participation in that story, normally entails my cultivation of a memory that helps me to see how God's story fits together, allegorical interpretation, and how that word may come true in my immediate present, tropological interpretation. Okay, so now that we have an initial sense, I think, of how this sensitivity to media works, and of how an ear for it might be able to unpack a lot more of the tradition's wisdom about media use, I now want to look a little more closely at how Thomas Aquinas handles memory formation. I turn to him both because he pushes us towards a clear account of memory's importance, and also because I think he's working in a context of pronounced technological and social transition that I think resembles our own in important ways. So during this time, we see a slew of innovations or popularizations of earlier innovations that collectively make scribal literacy more tractable, more flexible, more accessible, more visual, less oral, and also less demanding of the reader's effort, prior formation, or current insertion into a specific reading community. So the story of scribal literacy, well before print, is a little complicated, and it gets complicated right now, and this is exactly where Aquinas and other people who have a lot of interesting things to say about memory are working. This is also the time that's the context for Ramon Llull, for one thing. I'm actually really interested to kind of dig a little deeper here to see what's there. Books become smaller and more portable. We get the first full edition portable Bibles at this time. Visual layouts, tables of contents, cross-referencing systems all expand, become more common. Subject indexes and biblical concordances come to be during this time. The arbitrary order of the alphabet. An alphabet can help you organize things, but it's technically arbitrary. There's nothing in accordance with reality about A, B, C, D, E, right? This starts to replace the order of nature or the narrative order of salvation history as the principle for organizing books, or for setting books up in such a way that you can find your way through them, or coming up with a secondary reference text that helps you get into the first book. So now we begin to see a kind of thirst for a bigger openness to arbitrary organization methods, precisely to help you have a more fluid, more tractable entrance into previously much more difficult texts. And all of this is happening during a relatively rapid process that incorporated a lot of local communities into larger political, economic, and communication systems, a corresponding increase in mobility and social fluidity, urbanization, the growth of a professional class that now makes a living by managing symbols like money or Latin or law. And a sense of vertigo before all these, the resulting deracination, the anonymous exchange, the social complexity, and during this whole time, you also have a deepening thirst for ecclesial reform in light of widespread corruption, as well as a perceived sense that the church is not really meeting the needs of its changing society. Sounds familiar, I think. A lot of this. It's not exactly the same. There are real but incomplete similarities here. And I think it makes this moment an interesting conversation partner when we're thinking about questions about how the church should confront technological change and the social change that comes with it. So I'm just going to give you a little piece of this by looking at Aquinas. There are other really interesting figures here to see. Hugh of St. Victor is one of them. The Aquinas stuff that I really want to give you is really dense, and so I'm just going to focus on that, okay? But ask me about Hugh later, and I'll tell you more about it. One of the things you see happening here is that even though you might think that all these, the multiplication of portable texts, along with all these techniques for accessing texts in a more accessible way, in a more fluid way, would lead to a kind of sense of obsolescence of memory. That memory will fall by the wayside, but that's not actually what happens. It's a lot more complicated than this. And memory kind of stays around. And some of the leading lights in the Catholic Europe at this time are kind of thinking a little more deeply about it and retooling it in ways that, in a sense, you could argue are ways of coping with what's going on. Let's look at what Aquinas has to say here. First of all, why he thinks a good memory is important. Thomas argues that a well-formed memory is one of the integral parts of the virtue of prudence, meaning that he thinks a well-formed memory is necessary for the full-blown use of prudence, as, quote, walls, roof, and foundation are part of a house. So prudence perfects practical reasoning. And so a well-formed memory for Aquinas actually has fundamental significance at the very roots of free and moral action. But so, like, why, right? Because, as he argues here, we need experience to wade our way prudently through a contingent world. And memory is where the accumulated experience of a prudent person is kept and gathered up in such a way that is accessible to practical reasoning in the moment. It's where all that experience that empowers you. Moral theologians talk a lot about the importance of experience. Memory is the place, a well-formed memory is the place where all that experience is ready to help you actually think well about action. Of course, okay, so at this point, one might wonder why we can't just focus on becoming good people and let our memories develop kind of indirectly as a slow byproduct of good actions. This is roughly what the second objection in this article asks. Isn't memory itself simply a kind of natural ability? Some people have a good one, some people have a bad one. So maybe shouldn't we just focus on becoming prudent and memory will just kind of catch up indirectly? Aquinas' answer here is that even if some have a better natural aptitude for memory than others, nevertheless, art and diligence, so wise techniques and earnest, diligent labor can make a difference with memory, just like with prudence itself. So at one level, the argument says, we can do something about this no matter where we start, given our natural aptitude. And it's going to make us better people because it'll make us more prudent people. Therefore, we are responsible for this. So that's the main argument here. But implicitly, you could also say this involves a recognition that if we don't do something about this, other cultural forces will shape our memory with their art and diligence, without our intelligent and free collaboration. So it's also a kind of rallying cry for taking responsibility for your inner life in an environment where somebody else is going to do it anyway if you don't get in there yourself as well. Okay, to show how memory can indeed be improved through art and diligence, Aquinas immediately provides us a rundown of a memory technique that medievals erroneously ascribed to Cicero. This is the kind of fairly well-known memory palaces tradition. This is where a practitioner will invest a good deal of meditative effort constructing imaginary memory palaces in which to place and organize striking images that then serve as emotionally charged reminders of the things we want to remember. So the first rule here enjoins us to tie our thoughts down to striking images. The second one arranges those images in an orderly set of places. The third rule devotes care to the emotions. And the fourth rule commits us to a regular meditative cultivation of our inner space. Now, okay, it is remarkable that Aquinas is basically saying, this is the sort of thing you should be doing if you're serious about being prudent. And I am kind of putting that out there. There is a little bit of shock value here. If this makes you a little bit uncomfortable, I think that's good. I am not actually saying, I'm not sure if I'm going to go all the way with Aquinas on this particular way of doing it, and there are complicated reasons for this. But it's a good question to ask yourself. We can learn a lot about our assumptions about education and prudence just by asking ourselves, why do I think this is not adequate to my time? If you have a good argument as to why, you've actually moved a step forward, I think, in the broader question about what kind of cognitive life is adequate to our time. And I think we should seriously reckon with Aquinas' suggestion. But even more importantly, I think that we can learn a lot about why memory matters by looking at some of the principles at work here. So first of all, Aquinas is really serious about taking full responsibility for wisely cultivating our lower level cognitive habits. This fits with what Mark has been saying about the cogitative power, taking responsibility for these things, right? It involves a good deal of direct and deliberate effort. It doesn't just simply happen by accident, indirectly, by committing to loving God and neighbor, or by reading the Bible, or by reading good novels, or cultivating wonder before creation, or even, sorry Tim, even full conscious active participation in the liturgy doesn't give you this. Obviously all these things matter, and they might matter even more, and they're all expressions of the love of God and neighbor. But it's really interesting to me that Aquinas doesn't let you off the hook here. He also says, and you need to directly think about this. So 1 minute to 30 minutes?
Mm-hmm. 1 minute to 30.
Okay. Two more things, I'll put them out there, and I'm going to throw out some suggestions about, if we don't do this, what this might actually look like. For one thing, another thing that's implicit here is that memory is prospective primarily and only secondarily retrospective. It's primarily about how you equip yourself with a well-digested sense of the past so as to have that well-digested sense of the past ready to action, ready to hand for your practical reasoning here and now. That's why the past matters, so you can live in the present for the sake of the future here. That's why memory has to be organized well, so that it actually helps you exercise good practical reasoning. And then lastly, this is an irreducibly interpretive sense of how memory works. You have to select what parts of the past matter and why, how you should feel about it, what it relates to, how it fits into your overall sense of God's story, right? I would argue memory, all information techniques are themselves a form of interpretation. But I think this is important to kind of put out there because the idea that memory and is the idea that human memory, even biological memory, is only about information management, about storage, moving around, retrieving, displaying information, is basically what computer engineers since the 40s, 50s, and 60s have assumed about us when they have been developing everything that leads all the way up to digital media now. Vannevar Bush thought this way, Douglas Engelbart thought this way, and it's important to kind of think about the way in which Aquinas presses back on this and says, no, a memory is a highly interpretive activity no matter what, even when we're talking about things like big data. Okay, so let me close it so that you're not left in despair if you're not going to do the memory palaces. Let me give you some suggestions about how the principles here could be applied anyway. So I want you to think about some practices that are already kind of ready to hand in the Catholic life. So praying the rosary, the hours, the Mass, stages of the cross, etc. Reading the Bible, maybe reading Christian literature, right? So you can do two things at this point, right? The first thing you can do is to kind of reflect on your own activity of these things in terms of what Aquinas and others give us, media as a memory technology, right? How are all these practices, which in some way or another involve media in the moment or involve media in your preparation to do it? Even when you know how to do the rosary, you might still be doing the beads. Why is that? So how is this working as a kind of memory formation? Awareness of this, in turn, may give you an even better sense of what kinds of logic are at work in the tradition, which we can then apply in our questioning about communication in a digital world. So at one level, this kind of generates a set of questions about what it is that we're even doing, right? It's partly about insertion into the narrative of God's story, but it's also about forming a particular memory structure. What kind of structure is that? Why is it like this? Okay. But the second thing you could do, right? Let's take Aquinas a little more seriously just for 5 minutes. What if after praying the mysteries of the Rosary, or during praying the mysteries of the Rosary, we actually spend a little bit more time using those mysteries as a set of memory places in their own right? Not to memorize like a shopping list, but to link up other things that matter to us in the faith that we might want to associate, say, with the Nativity. Maybe every time I pray the Nativity, right, I imagine the same exact image of what it may have looked like. I kind of commit to a single description of it so that it'll look the same and it'll have that kind of stability, and I can put reminders of other things that matter to me that have something to do with this in my sense of the faith, or what matters to me, what kinds of things I want to put before the Lord on a regular basis while I'm praying the Rosary, right? And so the practice of the Rosary itself becomes more and more enriched, more and more entrenched in the tradition. Or maybe next time you read the Divine Comedy, you might actually commit a few more minutes after each canto to actually memorizing the structure of the Purgatory and the exempla that are in it, to reflecting on what they mean, and maybe adding your own. This isn't that hard, right? It only might take a little bit, the same amount of time that we might spend when we're bored on a smartphone. But the biggest take-home point here is a kind of general responsibility for our inner cognitive structures as part of our greater responsibility for all of the scaffolds we use, all of the media we use, as we make our way towards God as our final end. Here we go.